Zorgamazoo, we're getting to the exciting conclusion. We're reading, I think, 14 and 15 today. And remember in 12 and 13, I think we found out about this Dulbert, and he thought he had a plan to get all the tedium steam, and they sent him to go find it. Remember, they launched him into space. Okay, here we go. The hero himself. When Dulbert arrived at the end of his tale, he seemed hollow and breathless, pallid and pale. His eyes, they were fixed on the dark of the night. "I'm sorry," he said. Then he switched off the light. "Come back," called Katrina. She clutched at her bars. She rattled her cage by the light of the stars. But there was no answer, just silence and gloom, as phantom-like shadows rose up in the room. "We're done for," said Winnie, who started to cry. "We'll languish in here till the day that we die." Morty, meanwhile, uttered nothing at all. He was hunched in the corner, curled up in a ball. He was trying his utmost to whistle a tune, to cheer himself up with his usual croon, but all of his music was caught in his throat so that nothing came out, not one single note. "I say," said a voice. "Yes, haven't we met? I'm certain we have. I would never forget." It came from a creature half eagle, half cat, in a cage near the one in which Mortimer sat. This was a griffin, part lion, part bird. He grinned in his cage, he chirped, then he purred. He was staring at Morty with wonder and awe. For whatever reason, he liked what he saw. "You've come," he exclaimed. "I knew it was you. And take it from me, you're way overdue. But one thing's for sure, you look pretty good. Younger, I'd say, than I figured you would. A bit chubby, perhaps, but perfectly fit. You hardly have changed, not even a bit." It took Morty a moment to figure it out, that he was the one being spoken about. "I'm sorry," he said. He was rather bemused. "I don't think we've met. You must be confused." "No, no," said the Griffin. "You misunderstand. I know that old face like the back of my hand." He's called to the others. He summoned the troops. They gawked from their cages in curious groups. "Over here," called the Griffin. "Look who it is. It's the valiant explorer, that wandering whiz. They told us this guy was incurably sick, but that was just drivel, just some sort of trick, because here he is now, no longer at large. He'll help us escape. He'll be leading the charge. I know you all know him from ogre to elf. It's Bortleby Yorgle, the hero himself." The words of the Griffin were taken as cause for whooping and cheering and joyous applause. Morty, however, was sort of ashamed. It wasn't his fault. He couldn't be blamed. "Folks," he said quietly, shifting his weight, "I'm sorry to have to set all of you straight. I wish I could help. I mean, we're in a jam. But I'm not the Zorgle you think that I am. So my news isn't good, but rather it's bad. You've got me mixed up, I think, with my dad." The Griffin stepped back, clicking his tongue. "I suppose that you're right. You're just a bit young. But wait," he went on, "that magical beast. You're a Yorgle, remember? That's something at least. That's a name we admire, a name we revere. It means something special to everyone here." The others agreed. They knew Bortleby well, and all of them there had a story to tell. The mermaids, for instance, recounted a time when Bortleby Yorgle was still in his prime, exploring the sea that lay under the waves, the channels and currents, the coral and caves. In a green submarine through bubble and brine, to depths where the water was darker than wine. It was there he discovered a mystical town, glowing like jewels in the crest of a crown. A silver metropolis, gleaming and sleek, but the town called Atlantis was springing a leak. So he made the repairs with the help of his sub, like plugging the drain when you hop in the tub. And for saving their home in the briny abyss, the mermaids gave Bortleby Yorgle a kiss. A pixie named Quixie was next to recall how her people had learned to play Zorgali ball. She spoke of her youth on the Malabar coast, where the sand was as pale as the soul of a ghost, where life was idyllic, untroubled and free, on the fanciful banks of the Indian Sea. One evening as Zorgal was found on the shore, he was dripping and drowning and soaked to the core. Unconscious, he lay like a heap in the sand, with an odd-looking sphere in the palm of his hand. Little by little, the Zorgal revived, bewildered and grateful at having survived. Since his manner was one that the pixies could trust, they mended his wounds with their magical dust. He explained how the storm had demolished his boat, despite all his efforts to keep it afloat, and how, when his vessel was lost in the squall, the one thing he could save was his Zorgali ball. The pixies were puzzled. It seemed a bit daft. Why not a compass, a paddle, a raft? When they asked him this question, Bortleby sighed. "I'll just have to show you," he swiftly replied. So that's what he did. He showed them the way, and they still play the game to this very day. Then a dragon named Eddie, enfeebled and old, recalled how he once had lost all of his gold. He had just sold his lair and moved to a grot, but discovered his home was unbearably hot. The cave, after all, had never been toured by the dragonish real estate marketing board, so Eddie, of course, had a terrible shock when his home bubbled over with lava and rock. But lucky for him, he escaped by a hair, by flapping away in the smoldering air. His treasure, however, was lost in the blast as Eddie stood watching, agape and aghast. His grot went kaboom, and his treasure was hurled to every lost corner in all of the world. Yet, though Eddie's treasure could hardly be saved, on every last penny his name was engraved. So as long as the pieces weren't melted or burned, he hoped that someday it might all be returned. Then one day it was. A package arrived. It was proof that some part of his treasure survived. And then there was more coming, one every day, from places obscure and out of the way. Packages brimming with shiny doubloons, or glimmering goblets and runkable spoons, and each with a letter signed off at the end, "Sincerely be Yorgal, your wandering friend." The creatures recounted, they all reminisced, they couldn't hold back, they couldn't resist. They each had astonishing tales to relate, old Bortleby legends of danger and fate. And then in the end, when at last they were done, having laughed, having wept, having shared in the fun, they all turned to Morty, their eyes full of trust, and said to him, "Please, you can save us, you must." Morty just shrugged. "Well, what can I do? I'm even more hapless and hopeless than you." As the words left his lips, you could see all around how the faces had fallen, how everyone frowned. It seemed all the hope had been sucked from the moon, like the air going out of a punctured balloon. It was then that their captor came sauntering back, his languid expression predictably slack. "Good morning," said Dulbert Hohummer III. He was followed by robots who wobbled and whirled. They were dressed in tuxedos and carrying trays like waiters in lavishly fancy cafes. They bustled about like bees all abuzz, and Katrina was struck by how hungry she was. Her stomach was rumbling. She moistened her lips. She was dreaming of succulent nibbles and sips. She was ready to gobble, to guzzle, to scarf, but seeing the food, she was ready to barf. "Ew," she exclaimed, her blood running cold. "It looks like manure that started to mold." "You're right," said a Yeti, who grumbled and sighed. "The first time I ate it, I practically died." But that's all we get. It's all that we're fed. The grayest of gruel and the stalest of bread. And so they were served this slippery slop, plopped into bowls with a glup and a glop. It was slimy and lumpy and thoroughly rank, and the way that it reeked, believe me, it stank. Dulbert stood back, surveying the scene. He blinked as the creatures went queasy and green. "You know," he said absently, tilting his head, "I was snooping before, and I heard what you said. This Bortleby Yorgel, this one you respect, he's among the next victims I'm set to collect." "Oh, I'll try to be delicate. I won't be too rough. But I'm on my way now to Underwood Bluff. The Zorgels who live there are last on my list. It's important, you see, that no one is missed." "You can't," Morty cried. "My father's too old. He's sick, and he can't even handle the cold. He shouldn't be moved. He's feeble and frail. His heart is so weak it'll probably fail." "I'm sorry," said Dulbert. "Just doing my job." He took out his watch, which hung on a fob. "I've no time to chat. I have to prepare. This business, you see, is a tricky affair, and sadly I see that I'm falling behind, so I'll be on my way, if none of you mind." He bid them goodbye with a spiritless wave and left through the shadowy door of the cave. Morty said nothing, just stood there and stared. He was rigid with rage, but he also was scared. He began to feel faint. He began to see spots, recalling with terror those Octomobots. "Katrina," he said, his mouth going dry, "I'm feeling like Winnie. I'm ready to cry." He slid down his bars to the mesh of the floor, feeling even more gloomy than ever before. Katrina went over to offer some cheer, to say something kind into Mortimer's ear. But what could she say? What could she do for a friend who felt so unconsolably blue? So gently she rested her hand on his head, because sometimes our words are best left unsaid. Don, don, don. 15. A wing and a prayer. It was then something rather surprising occurred. A noise drifted up like the chirp of a bird, like a floor giving way with the tiniest creak. It was reedy and shrill, going squim, squibble, squeak. In the cage just below her, an ogre was there. He was polishing something with hanks of his hair. The object was round, like a peach or a plum, which the ogre had clenched in his finger and thumb. See him? Okay. He would spit on the object, then polish and rub, giving every last inch a meticulous scrub. Therein lay the source of the curious sound as he burnished this thing that was perfectly round. The ogre himself was the usual kind. He was crooked, decrepit, and hardly refined. Though his arms and his legs were spindly and svelte, his belly was plump. It hung over his belt. His jowls were like rubber, his nose like a twig. His feet were all grubby and terribly big. He was old in his bones and he needed a shave. He already, it seemed, had 1 foot in the grave. Katrina, intrigued, put her face to the floor. She had never encountered an ogre before. "Excuse me," she said. "Hello there, I'm new. I've only just come to this weird little zoo." The ogre looked up, his face like a mutt. His one eye was open, the other was shut. "Well, missy," he said with a yellowy smile, "you'll be here forever, or at least for a while." He laughed at his joke with a rascally smirk, going back to the squeaks of his polishing work. Katrina, still curious, wanted to know what it was that he did in his prison below. "Sir," she inquired, acting prim and polite, may I ask you a question to see if I'm right? That bauble you're shining like silver or brass, I'll bet it's your eyeball. Is it made out of glass?" "It is," said the ogre. "It's a pretty good fake. I take care of it, see, so it won't ever break." Then he held it aloft with the pupil in view. "So yes, it's my eyeball, and what's it to you?" "Well," said Katrina, "here's what I think. We can get ourselves free of this miserable clink, because I've an idea that I'm willing to try. But the key to my plan, good sir, is your eye." The ogre recoiled, he cowered and flinched. His eyeball he clutched, and he clenched, and he clinched. He squelched it back into its usual place. in the wrinkly and puckered up hole in his face. Then he paused for a moment. He looked up and he smiled. He regarded Katrina with eyes like a child. Escape? He said vaguely. You think that we can? In that case, okay then, let's try with your plan. He plucked out the eye from the hole in his head. Be careful, it's precious, he breathlessly said. Then with a gesture like motherly love, he held up his eye to the shadows above. Katrina up top lay flat on her side. She reached through the bars, her hand open wide. After they made this uncommon exchange, the swap of the eye, it was certainly strange. The ogre's long arms fell limp at his hips. He looked to Katrina with quivering lips. A tear trickled out from his one-seeing eye. This cantankerous ogre, he started to cry. Don't fret, said Katrina. There's really no need. If we follow my plan, I think we'll be freed. Delbert, you see, he's forgotten that box, the one that controls all the cages and locks. It was true. There it was on the shelf by the door, a long way away, 50 meters or more. It sat there just blinking, that special remote, like a faraway lighthouse that beckons a boat. There it is, said Katrina, on a shelf over there. If we smash it, I think, beyond any repair, then the locks will malfunction. They'll go on the blink, and we'll stage an escape. At least, that's what I think. So my plan is to smash it by throwing your eye. We've got little to lose, so I'll give it a try. As the ogre stood cringing and wincing below, Katrina wound up. She got ready to throw. Stop! Came a cry from near where she stood. It's too far. You can't do it. Almost nobody could. It was Morty. He was suddenly back on his feet. To throw it that far, you need serious heat. When Winnie piped up, her eyes going wide, there's only one person to do it, she cried. Morty looked at Katrina surprisingly calm. That's right, he agreed, and he put out his palm. If you need something thrown, something flawlessly flung, you need Cyril, the slinger, Zipzorgle de Young. Katrina just smiled with a grin like a cat. Of course, she replied. I knew you'd say that. She handed the eyeball to Morty, and then it was handed to others again and again. It was passed through the bars from finger to claw, from dragon to pixie, from talon to paw, until at long last the eyeball arrived, a bit sullied perhaps, but having survived, in the place where the Zorgles were huddled and cramped, trapped in a cage that was bolted and clamped. Although they were crowded, for that was the case, they managed to shuffle and clear out a space, and there in their midst, looking timid and shy, was Cyril de Young, and they passed him the eye. Katrina said, Cyril, it's just like a ball, and we need you to throw it. Just fling it, that's all. But whatever you do, give it all that you've got. It has to be perfect. We've got only one shot. Cyril looked at the eye. He hefted its weight. He could throw it, he thought, and perfectly straight, but he'd never, however, thrown ever so far, or thrown with a ball so extremely bizarre. I don't know, Cyril said, the truth being told, that's a pretty long way, and I'm getting old. I used to throw hard, I used to throw fast, but my arm's not as strong as it was in the past. A few years ago now, perhaps 5, maybe 10, I might have been able to throw it back then. But the problem is, folks, that's one heck of a lob. It's too far for me. I'm too old for the job. Morty went to his bars. He said, Mr. de Young, don't forget you're the finest who ever has flung. I remember you playing back when I was a tyke. All those pitches you made, I mean strike after strike. Well, anyway, sir, I'm your #1 fan, and I know you can do it, or else nobody can. Cyril looked at the eyeball, at its singular stare. It looked back at him, hopeful, like everyone there. He knew then he'd try. There was no other choice. I'll do it, he said, in a whispering voice. He started to stretch, started limbering up. He flapped both his arms with a whip and a whoop. He narrowed his eyes, he chewed on his lip. The eyeball, he squeezed, and he shifted his grip. He lifted his leg from the place where it stood. Then he flung that old eyeball as hard as he could. It went off like a streak, like a shot from a gun. It zipped through the bars without touching a one. It careened as it flew. It spun through the air. It was off on its own on a wing and a prayer. Then it started to fall, began losing its steam. Too early, perhaps, or so it would seem, but then at the end of its elegant arc, everyone knew it was right on the mark. As Katrina had planned right from the start, it whacked it cracked it blew it apart. It ended its flight like a thunderous punch. It shattered the box with a rupturing crunch. But sadly, the ogre, through the bars of his cell, could see that his eyeball had shattered as well. "My eyeball!" he cried. "Oh, what'll I do?" He glared at Katrina. "It's your fault. It's you. I'll look like a pirate. I'll be wearing a patch. I might as well find me a parrot to match." He threw up his hands. He spat on the floor. He angrily kicked at the steel of his door, and just as he did it, as he kicked from inside, the door gave a creak. Then it opened up wide. "Huh?" said the ogre. "Well, that's a surprise. Who cares if I've got only one of my eyes? Because look, it's almost too good to be true. We're free, Miss Katrina. It's all thanks to you." The ogre was right. They were coming undone. Every cage, every lock, every single last one. Every manacle, bridle, every linkage of chain, they all opened up as if sharing a brain. All of these creatures that people believed were extinct, they all stood in shock. They muttered and blinked. And then one by one they opened their doors, coming forward like veterans of too many wars. Winnie looked over, and guess who she saw? Her cousins with Uncle and Auntie McPaw. "We're free," said her uncle, "thanks to you and your friend. Our troubles, perhaps they've come to an end." "Maybe," said Morty. "Don't get hopeful too soon. Remember, McPaw, we're still stuck on the moon." What Morty was saying was certainly true, and the facts of the matter were worse than he knew. Along all of the walls and just out of sight, mysterious figures were coming to light. At first no one noticed and nobody saw the flicker of wings and the teeth and of claw. The Octomobots were coming their way, like lions and tigers approaching their prey, with pinchers and grabbers all ready to snap, preparing a perfectly treacherous trap. But neither Katrina nor Morty to boot had a sense of their nasty pursuer's pursuit. From left and from right came a shadowy shape. So the question, good reader, is, could they escape? Dun, dun, dun.